The Xenoblade franchise has grown in a way I doubt many of us could have predicted when it first came to the Switch back in 2017. And I'm not just talking in terms of the exponential rise in popularity or sales. As a whole, this franchise, as some of you already know, arguably spans 25 years worth of storytelling if you look back at Xenogears and Xenosaga. But today, I just want to focus on the modern titles and really reflect on the thematic progression of them that's nurtured across the whole Klaus saga. Right off the bat, I'll say we're getting into every spoiler you can think of across each game, including the DLCs, so just full transparency with that up front. Generally speaking, everyone has different aspects of these games that resonate with them, but I think many of us also connect with the more existential questions posed by these plotlines too. At its core, Xenoblade is a series that very much contemplates how we exist in our respective worlds. How do we act out our lives, and what do we choose to live for? It asks that both individually and collectively, and I must say that the answers these games give both on the surface level and subtly when you reflect on certain things for a while, well, they've definitely stuck with me as a person. That being said, the best place for us to start, I'd say, would definitely have to be Xenoblade Chronicles 1. This is the game that started it all for me, and I have to imagine that's the case for a good chunk of people watching this as well. I admit I didn't know anything about the prior Xenoworks until my interest developed with 1, so I'll definitely say I have more of an emotional connection to the modern games than those earlier works, as I've only gotten into them over the past couple years or so. The connection I have with this game is interesting considering all the ways it inspired me just as a piece of fiction by itself during my teen years. Because see, in essence, Xenoblade 1 is a complex story in the simplest way, and that's what makes it great. Something interesting after all these years is if we're comparing 1 to Xenoblade 2, 3, and even the DLC games to some extent, is the presence of the cast members amongst everything. They're probably the most static in terms of how they exist as characters. Now, I know that's not a unique opinion considering lots of fans have also pointed out the same thing, but I actually feel like it works exceptionally well respective to Xenoblade 1 as its own body of art. I feel it's a bit underappreciated, to be honest. If we start from the first act of the game and look at how everything develops across the story, starting off the journey with a simple revenge plot is pretty effective. What works, I think, is the presentation of this entire sequence of events. You have the Mechon, which kind of represent this existential threat that everyone has a gripe with, and this basic goal of payback for all the suffering they've caused. And by the time you truly set out on your journey, you can clearly tell there's more to this world than what's initially being thrown at us, and there are stakes meant to ripple across however this narrative will play out. And it's interesting because I actually feel like this kind of storytelling is sort of opposite to Xenoblade 2's intro. Xenoblade 2's first chapter actually throws a lot of important plot points for the player to question as this sort of slow burn narrative takes form. And I remember questioning whether that was to the game's detriment at the end of my first playthrough, though ultimately I feel it's actually more of a strength, but more on that later. But yeah, Xenoblade 1's cast operates with these sort of motivations that, while yes, are mostly static through the duration of the story, have a core to their identities that gives them a ton of heart. Compared to the other games, no one has a really dedicated, profound arc outside of Shulk and Melia, sure, but I'd argue that's actually okay, because it's the essence of who they are in a basic sense that makes up for it. These are people that just want to live in peace and not have their homes under siege. And when you think about that, it's easy to see how the events of this grand world is being imposed on these characters. It works in a narrative sense and is also aided visually with how small and even outclassed you are in the way of power scaling. The scale and magnitude of everything happening is a force of nature you must contend with in spite of those odds. Also, let me real quick just say from a personal standpoint, to this day, even after everything that's come out across 2, 3, and their DLCs, I still find the entire 7 reveal moment to be one of the best scenes in the entire series to date. I personally just love everything about the atmosphere, the shock, the fact that upon a first playthrough, Fiora may still be completely gone as she seemingly has this new personality and you don't know if she's still in there. All of the dialogue between what we later know to be Mayneth and Zanza here suggests there's a much bigger game at play, going far beyond the vengeance Shulk is currently fixated on. And you can see it right as their conversation is interrupted by him charging in with nothing else on his mind. He doesn't even pick up on how this face Mechon is behaving differently throughout the whole encounter. It's interesting because by the time everything plays out, we see how that singular focus in him has fragmented with this revelation a bit, but by then, we also opened Pandora's box with the Monado powering up. It's all the later parts of the game that really start to reveal how this journey is becoming way more than getting even with a giant robot. You know, there's the slow realization as certain plot points develop that our protagonists are seen as the bad guys by way of the Bionis' actions. And once Egil really comes into the fray, we find ourselves at the bottom of the whole world, and thematically our lowest point for the time being. In moving forward, the cast has to establish new goals, and in doing that, reaffirm their commitment to helping one another. Charla reminds Ryan he's still useful in helping Shulk get by despite his new strength. Ricky points out the importance of Dunban's role as a mentor figure, and we start to get our first real impression of Mayneth in deciding to help her. We learn how she was kind toward a vessel that once had its own autonomy. And it's interesting because now you're in a place where you have to decide whether to fight for something far bigger than your initial desires. And in a lot of ways, much of this fight isn't something any of the cast signed up for. It's deciding whether to accept the burden of breaking cycles of dysfunction I think Shulk grapples with when he keeps needing time to sleep on things. And this is what I mean when I say Xenoblade 1 is complex in the simplest way. Because the whole plot point of Egil's short-sighted hatred and how it perpetuates the continuation of it very much parallels real-world travesties. And I remember being a teenager and thinking of how his attitude, unfortunately, is reminiscent of real people from real communities whose very existence has been disregarded and persecuted against. You know, picture whatever group of people you want in your head right now. It's a tale as old as time.
Vanea, where have you been?
Egil, why do you go so far to destroy the Bionis? We survived that battle. We should have created a new world in which we could live in peace. And we still can.
The rage of those who were annihilated by the Monado will never dissipate.
Think not about avenging the dead. Think of the living. Please, Egil. I don't want to lose you. Are you so resigned to giving your life for this?
Life or death, I care for neither of these. The agonized cries of our brethren resound within my ears. Until they are silenced, I am deaf to all else.
Egil.
The collective suffering of a people has always led to those who want retribution. And when I think of this again years later, I feel it's clear this cycle presented from 1 also represents the anger stage of grief when it comes to human beings. I don't know, maybe that interpretation is obvious to some of you guys, but I don't really see anyone talk about it in discourse. Like, I see all the stages of grief present across the series now that its main trilogy is wrapped. Egil is anger, Jin is depression, N is definitely bargaining and definitely denial, and most notably, the way of acceptance is found in different ways through all of the game's endings through our cast members. With Xenoblade 1 specifically, that acceptance is an appreciation for the simple world as it can live outside of what's essentially someone else's toxic cycle, namely Zanza by the end of it. Like, I've always loved this scene because it's such an acknowledgement that the root of all this strife is a byproduct of someone else's hubris, and Shulk realizes that at the last second. He realizes that everything happening in the present moment isn't truly what he desires in his heart of hearts. It's essentially Shulk being able to look beyond his emotions and see how the circumstances leading to all of this strife don't have to undermine a world where they live in peace, a world where they can coexist and understand each other. It's interesting because I think the most basic tenets of religion push for this kind of thing, but as Zanza's reveal plays out, his role as a false god becomes way clearer. I remember taking note on my first playthrough of how distinct his imagery was. This pristine arrangement of white and gold. a graceful aura around him, a halo variant to show divinity, and yet he is anything but benevolent. The notions of mortals who appear so insignificant to him and his disciples are far more compassionate than the god of this very world. Now, when we're summing up the philosophies of this game, there's a fair amount of connections between these plot elements and the concept of Gnosticism, right? Which many have brought up before. And if you don't know, the idea behind Gnosticism is the creator of the universe is basically a divine entity that is actually a tier below a more supreme being. And in essence, this lower god represents that which is detrimental to humanity, along with an idea that there is a savior-like figure embodying a connection to this sort of true divinity that we're meant to reconnect with. When you look at the narrative within the third act, it's very easy to see how the story parallels these ideas, but I think it takes its own identity with the option to redefine what an ideal existence is altogether, ironically through the mythos of the Monado, and by extension, true Monado, which is basically the highest enlightenment I guess you can say for this world setting. Because, you know, you have the true Monado, which is connected to Alvis, which is part of the Trinity processor, which is connected to the Zohar, and by proxy, way above Zanza. But the thing with true enlightenment, or ascension, or whatever you want to call it with the Monado, is that Alvis leaves the choice for how to embrace that path in Shulk's hands alone, albeit with a bit of guidance here and there. Sure, he sees how this all can play out, but it's ultimately Shulk that has to reach the conclusion for himself, through his own volition, regardless of what paths are likely to happen. And we even see this with Alvis's new form in A alongside Matthew later on in the series as it comes full circle. In essence, that is the true Monado, your reason for wanting to live in this world, your conviction for how best to exist. Embracing that is finding one's way, and it doesn't have to be based in divinity. The foundation for one's existence can be rewritten. That's part of the reason why I actually disagree when people say the true Monado is Alvis's sword, because it always felt like the whole point was to help Shulk, and by extension the rest of our cast, make it their own tool of creation. It just so happens that these simple static characters want nothing more than a simple world to live out their days in. Gnosticism and mainstream Christian sentiments in general see us essentially return to God, return to our most ideal state of being, but Xenoblade 1 kind of takes that and presents those notions as a twisted version of itself with how Zanza's ambition created this cycle of suffering. That's why the notion of crafting a future in this instance, as well as the series' entries to come, is so meaningful. Humanity in its flawed and imperfect state does not need to return to divinity to be whole or worthy. Rather, they can move forward beyond whatever initial purpose was laid out for them, and I think Main's character helps show this as well. And in an intriguing way, it's because of all this, the journey feels like an ascension to heaven at this point in the trilogy, just one that's manifested through our own choices. As a game by itself, that resolution for Xenoblade 1 is simple yet profound enough to stand on its own. But after connecting it with everything else all these years later, you start to see a progression with those very human themes, and how now, moving forward in the series, we're getting stories that are even more character focused, namely with Xenoblade 2. Now, right off the bat, I really do have to gush about how much love I have for this game. I distinctly remember seeing the very first trailer for Xenoblade 2 and being super intrigued, except I did not have a Switch at the time or any means to get one, because money. So, that meant I would end up waiting a good 2 years before I'd get a Switch Lite for Christmas. And what was the first game that I bought for myself for that Switch Lite? It was Smash Bros. But the second, that was Xenoblade Chronicles 2. At the time, I was honestly going through a rough patch in my life, but I generally got so much joy out of taking my Switch with me to work every day and playing Xenoblade every chance I could get. I would literally fit my Switch in my pocket, get as much work done as I could, and then just sneak to the bathroom just to get play sessions in. And then I'd play during the whole train ride home after work too. So yeah, I definitely have some fun memories with this little game. And I think immersing myself in a story that very much pits optimism against nihilism came at the perfect time in my life. What's also perfect timing is how everything in these early chapters plays out within 2's narrative. I mentioned doubting the pacing for a hot second during my first playthrough, but I think it helps to understand something about this world. Namely, Rex's journey essentially starts off thrusted in the middle of everything, and yet it's a slow burn toward him helping everyone he connects with find their way. That's why the bombardment of plot info in this first part actually helps the narrative in the long run, I think. Everyone we meet from Torna, Jin, Malos, Nia, and even Azurta to some extent, they all have a ton of baggage that predates us. They're already in the midst of their journeys in a way that's merely playing out full speed by the end of chapter 1. Like, I remember listening to this bit of dialogue between Malos and Pyra and being like, wait, how old is this dude exactly? Like, you're trying to piece the connections with what little context you have, and the answers, along with the significance of them, are fed to you bit by bit. Slowly traversing the world after this is fascinating because Xenoblade 2, at least in my opinion, by far has the richest world setting out of all of the games, both in the way of aesthetic and lore-based culture. That's why it's so fascinating that despite this surface beauty, this world is defined by a sort of regret and melancholy, actually. And it's intriguing because you can very well point to Xenoblade 3's core plot exploring those sentiments as well, but I think 3 does it in a more unique way where individuals are used to represent collective desires because, well, Ionians are barely able to form culture among themselves, while the world of 2 is bustling with it. And so 2's angst is more balanced with the individual and collective level of its inhabitants. You know, by the time we reach chapter 3, there's this understanding that Allrest has endured the worst of humanity's presence as a whole. Though, as an aside, I do think Xenoblade 3 does the best job of depicting brutality and savageness of war across all of the games, but more on that later. It's pretty special how, even as they initially start out as adversaries to one another, it's our cast that imbue new life into the world as we follow them and get attached to their developing personalities, and Rex, along with everything he stands for, exists at the center of that. If Xenoblade 1 is the grand scale and phenomena of the world acting on its characters, then Xenoblade 2 is our characters acting on the world in the opposite way, to put it simply. The climax of chapter 3 is a perfect example of this in so many ways. Like, at what's currently the highest point in the world, we have a look at how humankind's imprint can lead to some denouncing it, and inversely, how the altruism of someone like Rex isn't enough to simply dispel that in this immediate battle. It's kind of this first instance representing how Rex's optimism, while noble by itself, needs to be developed if he wants to live up to someone like Vandam, if his will is to contend with the way of this world and fight his own war. The matter of will and conviction is also interesting because you can very well point to Mithra's entrance here being an example of her and Pyra walking separate paths that Rex mentions later in chapter 7. Because and I don't see people talk about this a lot, this scene, in retrospect, is a huge moment of character growth for Mithra. This is the first time she's woken up since the end of Torna, and despite everything that happened and all of the rigidness with her personality that was pointed out by everyone at the time, this fight shows her exercise the most precise, controlled use of her power to date. Aside from what is technically gameplay, Mithra does not move from that single spot this whole fight. All of her attacks are focused and targeted, ironically in the most refined way possible. Even though her and Rex's relationship are at this initial stage, it's just another example of characters in this world already being on a path of development, considering this awakening is already a big moment for her. And yet, at the same time, it's still very much a work in progress because, well, you can also point to her lack of mobility as a point of hesitation given everything that's happened. It's that bit of fear of losing control that she still holds on to at this point in the game, and she becomes more open about it as she opens up to Rex. It's also during these next few chapters, I'd say 4 to 6, where we get insight on more backstory for Allrest, and just what kind of scars shape this world despite its blossoming exterior. Stuff like kids pickpocketing because their village was decimated by bandits, or how Indol's refugees oppose Blades due to the constant war, and even just the overall history of the Tantalese and how it's covered up to the point where their society is on the brink of collapse. All of this, along with the individual relationships explored here, contrasts to Rex's sense of optimism as it's pitted against the reality of the world. With our cast, it's really interesting to see how the adults in the room, Morag and Zeke, warm up to Rex. For the former, who's used to the rigid structure of politics and upholding one's duty, Rex's conviction is a simple-minded one, but one she starts to see is tried and true, and that fascination to see how far he can take it, how much he can nurture it, grows as they move from adversaries to allies to even friends. It's a similar sentiment with Zeke, albeit I feel like something severely underrated with him is that Rex is everything Zeke wanted to be at his age. Zeke has kind of taken the opposite approach to Morag when it comes to the status quo of their respective nations. We learn more and more of how he wanted to travel on his own to help people, not just turn a blind eye on the outside world. But in a way, the practicality of that ambition was limited. And so he sees the same potential in Rex, he sees that same light trying to realize its potential, and I think that's why he's drawn to the kid. So, I'd say it's fair to infer that both of these adults in our party have seen much of Alrest's underbelly, and I think this is where you really get a sense of the dualism of this world. There's almost this acceptance for this cycle of dysfunction beneath the surface of Alrest. People taking advantage of others, being misplaced geographically, blades being mistreated, titans are slowly dying, and if you're Morag or Zeke, you do your best to contain it and help where you can, and if you're someone like Nia, well, you may have to hide from it all entirely. You don't have a chance to nurture your true self or find those who would accept it. And you could see this reluctance from everyone to some degree around the optimism Rex brings to the table, because it does exist in this world. There is a reason to be attached to it that people find happiness in. But in the eyes of some like Jin, there's no place for such altruism, at least not anymore. The concept of a best suited world like Elysium is mirrored in naivety, and by the time we have that big loss to them in Tantal, and all the introspection after, there's a lot going on I feel you have to look at in retrospect with regards to what Torna's DLC story brings. For Jin, Laura represented the best of humanity, right? She embodied the true sentiments of compassion and decency, and, well, her death was a decimation of that. Not just in the literal casualty of war sense, but in terms of her presence altogether. For him as a blade, losing memories, to be made to forget and have this moment not exist in the minds of anyone, that's the greatest offense to him, and it's one he couldn't bear. In his eyes, to move on from all that baggage is almost the true crime in essence. That's part of why he seals away those emotions and the attachment to those bonds. Jin differs from a guy like N, for instance, because for where N is actually very emotional, Jin's passion, and by extension his empathy, exists in stasis, underneath the disillusionment he holds for the world. And it's that very sentiment Rex gradually breaks and chips away at across their several encounters, while also gradually developing his own understanding for the more spiritual fatigue in this world. And it's interesting because by this point in the game, I've always felt Rex's speech to Pyra and Mithra had an interesting camera angle as the shot focuses on him and Jin for a moment. Because some may disagree, but I feel like these are the words Jin wished someone would say to him after all he's been through, and I'd wager contributes to what he sees in the kid. I think this moment represents the apex of someone genuinely seeking to understand and do right by the life of another. And it's really something for the story to take this high point and reflect on its implications by chapter 8. Because here, I have to further consider everything that Torna provides in the way of its story, considering it was originally intended to be shown here. With that whole narrative, even outside of what Laura symbolizes in the story, there's a similar kind of reverence and optimistic atmosphere you feel on the Tornan Titan and all the things happening on it. The people recognize danger, but there's still hope. There's still a faith that tomorrow is already secured. Once this is all over, as characters often put it. Despite her flaws, Mithra was just starting to feel a genuine connection to humanity beyond just acting as Adam's blade, or the Aegis. She matures and develops beautifully through this phase in her life to the point where right before the final battle, she's doing okay. She's doing better. Laura has plans to make a community for orphans they can call a home. Adam is excited to go back to a simple life post-war. Mikhail has found family that he's warming up to now. That's why it's especially heartbreaking as everything falls apart. And it's also why someone like Pyra's inception is just beyond inherently tragic in nature. Something I really don't hear people talk about enough. Like, you gotta think about the fact that Pyra's whole existence here is born from Mithra's trauma. Obviously, it's been pointed out that Pyra represents what Mithra wishes she was, but really sit on that for a moment. Pyra's character traits are every insecurity Mithra holds relating to her loved ones. To some degree, she's prim, proper, and refined, like Bridget scolds her for lacking, with even her main power source being flames that can be controlled. To add to that, Pyra as a sentient being is now brought into the world at its worst state, with the only memories of happiness and peace belonging to someone else. And yet she still takes on the burden of all the heavy memories as her own, and Mithra just lets her for 500 years. Obviously, yes, she wasn't going to tell Rex all of this right off the bat when they met, but I think it's clear from the early chapters of base game that Pyra really did internalize this role of being the Aegis who sunk Torna and killed countless people. Except she barely had any time to make true connections with anyone before being sealed away. She didn't get a chance to discover herself like Mithra did. She didn't have a chance to embrace herself as her own person. And yet, even after Rex and the rest of the party learned the truth, she never complains or seems to be at odds with Mithra, which I will say is a personal flaw I have with the game over these two. Like, I've always felt there should have been some reconciliation of everything I just laid out. I actually would have liked to see the two of them at odds over how unfair it was. There's a very brief allusion to it Mithra makes in a heart-to-heart, but that's about it really. The whole thing really gives weight to the chapter title, The Fear She Carries, don't you think? To some degree, you could probably also argue Adam may have been wrong in sealing Pyra away. In a lore-based sense, we know how busted they are being part of the Trinity processor, but something I've always maintained about the world-breaking power of this series is, similar to Xenoblade 1 as I mentioned earlier, it's not about the godly power wielded by these characters that truly matters in the end. It's the human element to themselves and what they choose to live for amongst one another that lets them carry such load, such burdens together. It's having these characters like Malos and Numa essentially learning how to be human, how to embrace the nature of desire and will. And so I think Rex gets a sense for that from traversing Moritha in chapter 8. This whole part of the story sits with the consequences of that humanity, both in ways we're already privy to with Torna's history, and some we're not with the Architect's origins. There's definitely this sense of desolation, both literally and in the way of regret over everything that's happened over the past 500 years. You know, a reflection on all the pieces of ourselves left behind. It's by this point many of the story beats are starting to link up, many of which alluding to how this cycle of grand ambition and decay always seems destined to occur despite the most optimistic efforts. And if you haven't by now, well, maybe it's easy to see how such reality leaves a world with very tired souls seeking relief from the way they've been existing. And now our characters are at a point where they must figure out how to reconcile that. It's something I think is made clear when Rex asked where all that angst ends. When you think about it, a lot of what's happening in these final chapters directly connects to themes in Xenoblade 3 amongst all the immediate resolutions to our cast in 2. That's a big reason why, after going through this part of the game and seeing how Xenoblade 2 sticks its landing, I really do feel it's the part of the trilogy representing this navigation through purgatory in a more abstract sense. It's the sort of thing where humanity needs to choose which paths to give credence to when it comes to believing in what's possible. And 2 contrast the weight of these perspectives against one another beautifully, especially during these chapters. One of the things indicating this is a subtle line you may have noticed repeated here that has similar implications to Xenoblade 1, basically questioning the collective will of the world.
I have seen your will to fight. It is time to decide. What do you say? Does this world belong to you, or to Zanza?
Perhaps. I want to see for myself. If this world has any will of its own, which one would it choose? You or Malus?
It's the sentiment of what will the world choose when presented with how to exist is the ultimate question. I think making those final choices embodies a lot of Chapter 9. Like, I gotta say, Mikhail's sacrifice originally wasn't something I had strong feelings over until after getting into Torna. But again, that's why it adds weight to everything. Being reminded of the light people once brought into your life is enough to change a person. And it's interesting to actually see that foreshadowed with Mick's character through Chapter 6 onward, if you're, looking back through the story. As a whole, there's this intriguing contrast of that with him choosing to move on, Jin later finding peace and moving on, and putting that against someone like a Malthus who, while very much serving as a foil to multiple characters in this story, exists as the worst version of himself until the very end. There's no redemption for a guy like him, even after meeting all these amazing people who want to break that cycle of dysfunction he himself has experienced and perpetuated. It's very much in line with there being these diverging ways of defining one's life and existence, despite everyone feeling comparable angst, blade or human. It's here that we see these characters arriving at final conclusions which challenge each other, and produces what I think is one of the most important moments of the series with Jin and Rex's final match. And it's cool because in my interpretation for this scene, I feel the delivery of dialogue shows that there's clearly a good amount of respect Jin has for Rex at this point. It's this thing where, like I alluded to earlier, he wants to believe in Rex's worldview, but both personally for him and conceptually, there's a fear that this cycle can't be broken in one's lifetime. No matter how strong the will or desire, those patterns of human strife and cataclysm are always going to rear their ugly heads. Every person who comes along that's like Laura or Rex eventually gets snuffed out despite their best intentions. One need only look at the abstract idea behind Mobius later down the line to honestly question if the sentiments of Jin, Malos, and Amalthus were unfortunately right. But the truth is, that's never the whole story. That only happens if you allow that light to die with you. That's why daring to share a wish for prosperity and hope with those who succeed you is so important. Not just because that's part of what Rex is saying here, but because by the end of this whole trilogy, we see this reality that there will always be those who choose for themselves to rise up and create a better world in the face of whatever darkness manifests. Now, just what is a better world is nuanced through Xenoblade 3, but I digress. The point for now is that sentiment, and even Jin's acceptance of it through saying their duty had been handed down, is so much more significant in the grand scheme of things. Those themes of doubt over one's existence, internalized fears and emotions we see soon after in Chapter 10, and just the fatigue that comes from eternity are all aspects of those more subconscious human facets that eventually gave rise to Mobius down the line. And you can see them here as sentiments that are very real, having been built up through the whole story, and in a way, still without a clean, clear remedy. But to some degree, I think I like that. I like that Rex's hope for this world is something that still needs to mature through his understanding of how people are shaped by their pain. And even in acting on that faith with that understanding in mind, he still doesn't have all the answers. It's ironic because despite his ambitions of getting to Elysium and being a light in the lives of others, he's not some messiah guiding everyone to the promised land. In a strange way, it's kinda similar to Shulk turning down the chance to be a god, I suppose. It's also worth noting that there essentially is no god of this world. Similar to Xenoblade 1, you've basically made your point to the highest point in the world, but I really don't think Klaus views himself as a god, but more so a foolish man also grouped in with the jaded souls of this world, and one who ends up learning more about humanity than he bargained for. Another reason why this game kind of embodies purgatory in my eyes. I think we all know by now he's the fulcrum of this series, not just in the way of his raw actions, but also in the implication behind his deeper ambition. Like, first of all, his monologue is one of my personal favorite moments of the series, and I think emphasizes what I was saying earlier about the human elements of these story arcs being the most important thing in the grand scheme of things. Like, it's very easy to look at the total sum of works in the modern Xenoblade series and feel like they're a rejection of religion and omnipotent existence. But a more nuanced reality I feel you'll notice underneath that is the positive tenets of religion and religious ideas are actually embraced by our cast. You know, forgiveness, loving your enemy, being selfless for the world, etc. But what's further explored through 3 and Future Redeemed is that the key to bringing out those best qualities don't need to be rooted in divinity, kind of like how I was saying earlier. Looking toward that all-encompassing power to secure the future, to secure your existence in perpetuity, is an outdated ideology that Klaus started everything with. And reflecting on this is something I've come back to with this scene and the whole experiment now that the whole saga has played out from start to finish. But even looking at it in isolation, it's pretty cool to watch this guy see his creation secure an existence outside of what he thought was possible, both within this world and with the part of himself that's Zanza. Like, in retrospect, I feel like Zanza is the narcissistic part of Klaus's mind that embraced being the sole arbiter for how humanity would move forward. And in the end, both aspects of him get put to rest. In doing so, we also see a resolution to Malos' story that's wrapped up at the same time. This is probably my personal favorite overall final boss / confrontation, and to be honest, I think I'd include Torna in that as well, which is interesting because I've always felt there's an intriguing contrast between Malos' character at the end of base game to when he was in Torna. And while I'm still not sure if it was entirely intentional, to this day, I feel like it works exceptionally well. The attitude of Torna Malos seems more amused with the grand conflict more than anything, and the plight of humans is just the punchline of it all. It's all bits of knowledge mirrored in absurdity he laughs at, but contrast that with his demeanor by the end of base game, and well, I've always interpreted him to be grieving in his own way more than anything. On the surface, he's dismissive and gets called out for it, but I think in his own way, he too had this sense of fatigue over the way of the world he briefly shows throughout the game. I really appreciate how it's very subtle and unique to Jin, but he too seems disillusioned with humanity compared to his reactions in Torna. The thing is, he struggles with understanding his own feelings, to put it simply, but I think deep down he knows they're there, and in a strange way, because he knows they're there, it goes beyond Amalthus' influence, just a little. That's why I feel this final confrontation with Rex is, like Jin, so important. In a strange way, I think Malos wanted Rex to win this fight. Not in the sense that he didn't mean any of his words here and had secretly become a morally sound guy or something, but rather, in his eyes, it would be nice if there was a conviction that supersedes the angst he was made to project onto the world without choice, as well as the overall angst that embodies it in general. If there was such a thing, he'd need to embrace his role as the adversary to it all. And if anything, I think that's clear with how he basically says so, and how it's contrasted to Rex proclaiming his role in bringing smiles to people's faces. It's interesting because across this ending, there's a semblance of peace brought to both Aegises because of Rex, with Malos' content being that he played his part to the fullest, and Numa ironically arriving at a point where, despite all the fear, doubt, and self-loathing she internalized across her existence regarding her power, is now more than willing to use all of it in the most purposeful way to save everyone. Her willingness to die is no longer founded in despair, but rather hope, and I think that's beautiful. Though, I will be honest, during my first playthrough, I got so attached to the characters, I was just mad at her death. Like, I've cried watching this ending since then, but on my first time seeing it, I was just mad. Like, I was legitimately pacing around my house, and then was just relieved when they came back. But yeah, like I've been saying, their whole sacrifice is made so much more impactful when you realize Rex letting go of them was basically a core thesis of Xenoblade 3. which I know is a bit of an oversimplification, but I really do appreciate it more after how the series wraps. Rex is human and can attest to similar feelings of longing and desperation, but as he matured and grew up, he realized the importance of paying it forward in many ways, and that's what makes him great in this trilogy. That leaves us with the final entry of the series, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which technically is not the next story in the timeline. That would be Xenoblade Chronicles Future Connected. Considering the events of 1 and 2 are happening simultaneously and Future Connected is a year after these events, it's a game that exists. Okay, listen, I don't think Future Connected is bad. It's a fun little adventure I enjoyed when Definitive Edition first came out. It's just, compared to all the other entries in the series, DLC included, it's definitely last on my list. At its core, it's a nice piece of connective tissue worth mentioning, given how it provides a nice payoff to Melia's character, while also offering hints of things to come. Like, you have to think about how cool it is for her to get a story at all that pretty much makes her the protagonist after 10 years of fans saying she was slated in base game. Now, I admit I went back and rewatched a lot of cutscenes and bits of dialogue for this video, just so I could really think about how I truly feel for this story after 3 years. And honestly, this whole story feels like a quiet reflection of sentiments. Like, its identity isn't rooted in being this souped up high action adventure, and I think when you're okay with that, Future Connected is pretty nice. This is presumably early days of the universe instability that would lead to Origin being created down the line, but you also see Melia having a premonition for this, not just in the literal sense, but also in the way of how people's responses to travesty and how they move forward isn't always met with clean answers. Like, it's really interesting because you have this little bit of acknowledgement while she's reflecting on Alchemoth, and I feel like you can point to her remembering that reality way down the line during her Ascension quest in Xenoblade 3, where she confronts those soldiers who resent her reputation as queen even after she tries to mend things between Kevez and Agnes. She tries to empathize with them in the moment, and she knows their emotions won't be swept away so easily. It's cool because you can see bits and shades of Xenoblade 3's themes across this story. Like, I rewatched one of the first quiet moments I originally saw on my playthrough, and it's crazy to see them talking about the freedom to choose here. To me, it just adds credence to this coalescence of wills developing across these games we see pay off in 3. Because in coming back to this, you really do see Melia come into her own and into the person she's meant to be. It's also so interesting how that's built up around Tyrea, and dare I say, one of the most groundbreaking, nuanced, beautifully crafted villains in all of media, with no one close to rivaling him, Galgar. Okay, I'll stop. But honestly, I guess if you want to entertain this guy's silliness, because, well, he's a silly boy after all, you'll see his motives are actually similar to some stuff in Xenoblade 3, as his whole thing is embracing hybrids as opposed to the pure ancestors of the past, saying everyone should just discard that old way of existing. It's another example where you're denouncing the past and how it laid the groundwork for you, and that in and of itself is corrupt. But it's just funny how lame he comes off out of everything you can talk about in this series. But yeah, I feel like a question this story asks for Melia is, what should someone with power stand for when put in front of those who perceive them? It's interesting because I think she learns to answer that for herself by the end of this. Though I admit a lot of Future Connected still feels a bit forgettable moving forward in the series, but then again, I do think Melia's character development does have a nice payoff by the end of everything. That being said, there's only really Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed left to look at in this saga, and it's so interesting because there's actually a ton of story you could tell regarding the time between 1 and 2 stories and the start of 3. And I know a lot of people also felt this way when the game first dropped, but I was really taken aback at how effed up the world had presumably become after these beautiful endings we had gotten in the series thus far. Like, what the heck happened that led to all of this? The framing is actually perfect both literally and thematically, because coming off the world setting of 2, and even FC if you're still going in order, this world is blighted in comparison, And there's no better illustration of that than the starting area that is, well, literally that. And yet, despite that, there's a difference in reaction toward the idea of a world that needs saving in this game. Despite the hidden nihilism defining parts of Xenoblade 2, a world where people live in harmony with each other is even harder for Ionians to conceptualize altogether, and even as they do, those feelings of connection are something that takes getting used to. It's something many of them can't seem to put into words because they've been so deprived of a healthy existence. That's not to say they don't have emotions or feel connections, of course, but going through the game from the beginning, you see how there is little beyond the most gruesome identity of this world. You're lucky if you find a few friends among your ranks to befriend, and even then, there's no peace of mind it'll last. There is little room in between what the world takes day in and day out. That's why it's pretty interesting how there's this implication our main group barely registered Van Damme's words at the end of chapter 1, and yet despite that, the group I think is super special, because see, the fundamental belief in a world like the ones we've spent so much time protecting in 1 and 2, that was never shown to them. They have no reference for people before them who fought and laid the groundwork. And yet, across these early chapters, we see them make the choice to inherit the will of unity and, by extension, Ouroboros, all by themselves. Of course, going through the game gradually shows us how the nature of that choice is a bit of an outlier to what the system of this world allows, as so much of the whole flame clock system, Mobius's existence, and prevalence of the endless now are rooted in human desire. Obviously, by this point, it's probably very clear how much of this series is rooted in human desire, but with Xenoblade 3 specifically, so much of the desires we've spent time nurturing across the first few games, longing for more time, wanting to defy fate, wishing for forever, essentially becomes corrupt sentiment by Xenoblade 3, thus giving rise to a collective unconscious that allows Mobius and the Endless Now to exist as we learn about, and to thrive as an essence. And the more I've thought about this, the more I feel Xenoblade 3 is also kind of a counter-argument to the series thus far, but also a story that builds on certain things as well. The best evidence of this, at least in my own reflection, ironically comes at the end of the game in Zed's monologue, where he kind of gives an interesting explanation for why the Endless Now manifested as this sort of Hunger Games environment. There's this implication that to secure your tenure in this world through overriding the will of another in combat, arguably the most raw form of self-expression, is the essence of life. It's this idea that life is designed to filter itself out. To secure that time which you hold so dearly by actively competing for it in the most ruthless setting is the essence of living. And in that, everyone will see their turn to do so in the cycle. Fundamentally, the Endless Now is an attempt to redirect the passage of fate, as so many across humanity have been bound and limited by it. At one point, Lanz asked a very reasonable question to make sense of all this.
So is it flowing or is it stopped? You're not making any sense, mate.
Zed's answer, in essence, is both. Fate flows toward the inevitable, and people only oppose it when it doesn't align with what they want for the future. Yet this system of being redirects that torrent toward a resurrection of people, places, and things, establishing rebirth, and thus letting fate play out while we presumably perceive the world in varied ways through many lifetimes without ever having to truly put them to rest. Except that last part never really happens in Ionios. What ends up happening is you can only exist in one way that perpetuates that cycle, lest the essence of your being be deemed incompatible with reality altogether. And it's an interesting thing because I think the nature of Mobius, despite being cartoonishly evil in Ionios, seeks to circumvent both that incompatibility and passage of fate as well. People buy into this promise they'll be free from not just death, but existential ruin and failure itself. They can hold their chosen way of existing in place without compromise. Except, ultimately, that's an illusion. A sham, as Noah puts it in chapter 7, because all it does is ensure stagnation, which is losing in and of itself. Of course, by then our cast already learned this. As individuals, they've learned that life, and in turn living, is so much more than validating your existence through denying another's. Like I said earlier, I feel the nuance of the individual is very much used in Xenoblade 3 to represent the larger collective, just on a more honed in scale. Like our main antagonists with N, M, J, and Shania feel especially personal, but each of their stories is wrapped in something tragic that comments on what this world does to people. A special bit of evidence for this, and one I really appreciate in this game, is the focus on characters' eyes during certain events. Not even just those antagonists actually, but everyone at certain points. The eyes are the most intimate expression of one's essence in a given moment. It's a brief look at the most authentic sentiments permeating through the oppressive system of this world, even if just for a second. The struggle to realize those parts of oneself is explored subtly, but also cleverly through the main cast. All the bits of angst and turmoil they overcome are symbolic for humanity as a whole. Feeling weak despite your role as the support pillar, feeling that your true self would never be accepted, feeling fear over the weight of death, blaming yourself for others' suffering when you're supposed to be the capable and composed one, feeling that what little time you have left isn't even yours, and feeling the need to find a way to cope with the world around you despite never truly wanting to grapple with all the loss. It was admittedly unexpected how, on my first playthrough, the presentation of these ideas were kinda shifted from a more sci-fi lens to what I would very much describe as a Shakespeare-esque kind of lens in this character-centric story. For instance, by the time you get to chapter 5 for the first time, everything about the progression through this climax is presented in a manner consistent of a theater drama. Zed even says as much about everyone's lives later on, but you can look at the camera angles, the close-ups, the framing of the shots in relation to who's speaking, and see how it's like a stage play. N even enters from stage left later on in chapter 7 in this game, which also makes me think of this. And on that note, by now most of us know this, but on a first playthrough, you don't initially expect so much of the game's themes to be funneled through N and M's story together, nor as individuals. Like, as someone who went in mostly blind to everything, I saw N for the first time and was like, isn't that Noah? Why are we gonna just pretend that's not a version of Noah standing right there looking all edgy? But yeah, by the time everything plays out, you really do see how the main group, even with all their angst, is the repentance M was talking about. Setting the world to rights isn't just a matter of fixing origin, but also choosing who to be in the face of what's essentially all the human angst built up across this series. And that's not necessarily something they ever thought they'd have to confront on such a deep level, but I'd say by the time they're all talking during Mio's side story in chapter 6, they genuinely have. Also, I do truly enjoy how the back half of the game has fascinating commentary contrasting their growth with Mobius more so as a concept and state of being, and I touched on that earlier with the Endless Now philosophy. But I still feel, even after over a year of reflection, that this third act is kind of flawed in its overall execution. Doesn't mean it's bad, nor that the game's thesis is diminished in my eyes, but that's still how I feel. I just would have liked more time seeing the ramifications of Y's experiments, more time with Chris so that fight felt more emotional, and more to do once you storm Origin. Like a final encounter with X should have been standard rather than optional, and the overall confrontation with her and Y could have been more impactful given their roles as avatars. And of course, I've heard countless complaints about the final boss overall. However, I do feel it's the best final boss from a narrative perspective. Or at least second best after Future Redeemed, but we'll get to that. Like I said, I touched on Mobius a bit earlier, but in a deeper sense conceptually. The essence of it is very interesting because becoming Mobius is an existence that can sneak up on you essentially. Seeking to maintain the status quo and exist in perpetuity is something that can be founded on relatable desires, as we've already seen through the whole series, and Noah and Mio acknowledge that relatability in chapter 7 through N and M's plight. But holding everything in place, as they say, only results in you becoming more callous to the ascension of new things in life, new ways of existing that require you to let go of what, in reality, hasn't served you for some time. And the game gives you hints for this as your interactions with Mobius build up, but by the end, you can clearly see this sense of desperation that defines such an existence. Desperation in trying to redirect the flow of fate that, despite the immortal power promised to you, ironically makes you weaker in the face of it. It definitely makes me think of the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I think much of Xenoblade 3 feels like a dismantling of that. By this point, I very much look at it as the final layer to the trilogy, going from heaven to purgatory and then hell, which is interesting because the progression overall feels like a circle more than a descent when it comes to where humanity ends up. And part of that is the combination of 3's ending and how it's very much elevated by everything Future Redeemed brings to the table, both as a literal final entry on the Switch and final bow on the series thematically. First off, two things. I find it hilarious that pretty much all of the cast in Future Redeemed is pretty much related to each other, either by blood or some weird connection, and then by extension of that, you realize Noah and Mio are like the ancestors of God knows how many people in the city, which is just crazy. Like, after finding out Matthew is related to N and M, it's super easy to notice how similar he is to Rex in terms of brashness in the most hilarious way, because Rex is technically like his great-great-grandfather, which also makes this scene in every interaction with Glimmer also funny by association. And then it's kind of wholesome thinking of A as kind of like an aunt, I guess, to Glimmer. But yeah, then there's the second thing, which is this whole DLC really threw me for a loop, like in a good way, because I was not expecting this story to make me think in the way it did, or to pay homage to the whole of this series' identity in the way it did. There are so many connecting threads to point out here, but I actually feel it's best to start with N, given, like I was just saying, he is basically the primogenitor to a lot of what's happening here. And I gotta say, after playing this story and all the time spent reflecting on it, N, to me, is an even more tragic character than Jin in the grand scheme of things. For starters, it's interesting how Zed found N and M to be some sort of outliers in the Ionian cycle, to the point he was fascinated by them, to the point I'd argue he outright took away what little peace N was able to find after his last death, through tempting him with being Mobius. Like, when you look at that, and you remember the countless iterations of death, combined with the fact that his early days as Mobius saw him slaughter his descendants, including his own kid, it's really no wonder this man's mind is so broken. And you could see it up close around Mio's homecoming in base game for the first time. But chronologically before that in Future Redeemed, his reaction to these events are interesting because I feel his fights with everyone actually solidify his delusion on being on the right path as Mobius. Like in this story, I really think N sees his family as ghosts in a way. In a literal sense, they're his descendants. Yet from his perspective, I feel like he sees them as a byproduct of an existence he's trying to discard. They're ghosts of his past in a similar way he refers to Noah as his own shadow later on. And it's actually funny because, and I could be wrong, but watching this again, it really feels like our Noah essentially bringing up Gondor was the final trigger that made him have a full-on meltdown here. It makes sense with him immediately saying his feelings never changed at all. Deep down, N knows he's damned himself and M, which is why he really didn't do anything when Matthew called him out on it and even hit him. He knew Matthew was entirely right, and N has carried that for essentially a millennia. What remedies so much of that baggage really comes down to the reflection Noah has in Chapter 5. Him learning to understand the meaning of the smile is, in my eyes, both a lesson that N never got, but also the same sentiment Rex hangs on to being inherited by someone else, and yet another reason why his words from Chapter 9 become so important down the line. That content as one lets go of everything exists because of what gets passed on to those who survive them, and in a world that affords so little, as Noah later says, repaying those lives is honoring their choice to smile in a reality as hellish as this one. N, on the other hand, is a character who very much struggles to accept the choices of others, and you can see that in his fight with Niall, notably. And if you really think back hard enough, you'll remember in one of their early Mobius fights, our Noah voicing a similar sentiment over taking the fall for if their plan failed, just serving as a little glimpse into these character flaws that have always existed in him. On that note, it's actually worth mentioning when you look at N along with Niall through the game, and even Matthew, I think it's very fair to say that this family does not handle death well.
Mio! 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 You're the one who couldn't protect her! In the end, you were powerless! And now she's gone! How could you? Answer me! I hate you so much. 1,000 deaths wouldn't bring me peace!
Matthew, easy now. Rage blinds you.
Why? Why can't you just leave us the hell alone?
I will say though, it's interesting how their lineage is used to explore the nuanced ways of accepting the world and moving forward, because I was super moved by how this plot essentially pits two fundamental ideologies for humanity against each other. One being Mobius, and the other expressed through Niall and Alpha's desire to discard everything in this world that's essentially outdated in Alpha's eyes for the sake of a new world, and a future beyond a stagnant present. In the same way I mentioned the humane desires behind Mobius are like corrupt versions of those we've seen through the series, Alpha's language and rhetoric are also a corrupt version of those conclusions that aimed for the future our previous characters reached. It ultimately makes you wonder just what is the proper way to move forward in life. I think that's a fundamental question asked in this story, and one that's acknowledging there's counter-arguments to what these stories have professed across their tenure. Ultimately, I really think we're seeing this final commentary on the theme of acceptance play out through the Van Damme lineage and its connection with all the legacy characters. Acceptance in the way of heeding the lessons of the past and making peace with everything that once was, and making a choice to manifest a future with that in mind. I think it's fair to say all these games have seen our characters grapple with that themselves across their journeys of breaking toxic cycles and trying to find a better way forward, while also acknowledging that it'll be hard and not just some utopia. And it's because of that the themes of wills coalescing and paying it forward become so prominent, because legacy characters like Rex and Shulk have accepted their time in the sun has come and gone, and they did all they could with the time they had, but it doesn't mean there's nothing they can give to teach and inspire those succeeding them. And it's crazy because for a while now, I've felt N at the end of Future Redeem internalizes this sentiment when Rex and Shulk adopt the Avatar role and he's watching them despite having his back turned. It's debatable whether it was intentional or not, but I really do feel like that moment, and in reality that lesson, stuck with him in reaching his own point of acceptance, both for himself and humanity after everything comes full circle millennia later. It's crazy because you essentially have a main character learning the lessons of the previous main characters when you really think about it. Really, it's everyone in the cast of 3's base game inheriting these lessons, and like I said, by the end everything feels like a circle. The path towards dismantling the world, while similar to those who came before, isn't based out of authoritative narcissism like Zanza, nor to cast aside those who serve no purpose in the world, but rather to craft a way forward in their stead because of the wishes those seemingly forgotten put into the world. Heaven, purgatory, and hell are all states of being humanity can find itself in, but what I think everyone accepts by the end is that there is no perfect world akin to Klaus's original ambition they should grasp for. Instead, what defines us has to be a choice made by everyone while acknowledging the fear of uncertainty and admitted potential for ruin. And in deciding that, in deciding what defines our existence, we may have the wrong answer sometimes, but even so, we'll recalibrate somehow. In that sense, everything returns to a, wait for it, point of origin by the very, very end. But now with a newfound wisdom, even Klaus the one who arguably represents humanity's foolishness, had to acknowledge and learn from. So yeah, it might sound corny, but after being into this series for like 10 years now, I really do try to apply the themes of this series to my own life in the real world. I didn't touch on every specific story beat or character arc here, but there's plenty I connect to on a personal level while I reflect on these stories, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who can say the same for their time with Xenoblade. That's what makes the series special after all. That's what makes it profoundly beautiful. There's many layers to resonate with and find solace in. Thankfully for us, that whole body of work living on the Switch gives many opportunities to do that. And as we undoubtedly approach a new console generation soon, here's hoping whatever new stories this franchise brings will do the same.